Dakota Territory, 1883. Lars Halvorsen raised his cabin the standard way, 16 by 20 feet on stone piers, logs kept dry off the wet ground. But that first winter taught him a brutal lesson. While his stove roared and room air hit 60 degrees, the floor felt like ice. Wind screaming under those piers turned his crawl space into a frozen wind tunnel. His neighbors called the problem normal: burn more wood, wear thicker socks, sleep closer to the fire. But Lars started piling fieldstone around his cabin's base, building a low wall 30 inches high to block that wind. Silas Morrow laughed at the wasted labor, called it a useless little fortress, said air under a house keeps it healthy, and stone belongs in root cellars, not around empty space. Then January 12th, 1888 arrived. The blizzard that would kill hundreds across the plains hit without warning. 60-mile-per-hour winds, temperatures plunging from 44 degrees to 42 below in a single night. Standard cabins on open piers froze families to the bone. Floors read 12 to 17 degrees, while stoves burned desperately above. But Lars's cabin, his floors held steady at 47 to 52 degrees, 35 degrees warmer than his neighbors. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about wind, earth, and heat that every other frontier builder missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. January 12th, 1888. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the thermometer outside Lars Halvorsen's cabin read a deceptively mild 44 degrees. Children played in shirt sleeves while their mothers hung washing on lines that snapped in the growing wind. But Lars had spent enough winters on the northern plains to read the signs, that peculiar yellow-gray light on the western horizon, the way his horses clustered near the barn with their tails to the wind, and most telling of all, the sudden stillness that preceded violence. By 3:30, the front hit like a wall of ice and fury. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the first hour, then kept falling. Wind that had whispered through the prairie grass now screamed at 60 miles per hour, driving snow sideways with such force that a man could lose his way between his cabin door and his woodpile. The storm that would become known as the Children's Blizzard had arrived, and it would test every assumption about frontier survival. In the standard cabin just 200 yards down the ridge, Silas Morrow's family huddled around their cast-iron stove as the building shuddered with each gust. The stove glowed cherry red, fed with split oak that Silas had cut and seasoned through the previous summer. The air near the ceiling registered a respectable 62 degrees on his mercury thermometer. But down at floor level, where his 3 children sat on quilts, trying to play jacks, the temperature told a different story entirely. Silas knelt and held his lantern close to the floorboards near the door. The mercury read 17 degrees. 17 degrees inside a heated cabin. A tin cup of water he had set on the floor an hour earlier now wore a skin of ice thick enough to crack when he pressed it with his thumb. His youngest daughter's breath came in visible puffs as she lay on her stomach, trying to warm her hands under her body. The boots lined up by the door had stiffened into rigid shapes that would need thawing before anyone could wear them again. This was the reality of pier construction in a plains winter. Silas's cabin sat on 10 carefully placed stone supports, each pier raising the log sills 24 inches above grade. It was textbook frontier building: keep the wood dry, allow air circulation, prevent rot. But that same airspace that protected his sills in summer had become a 24-inch-high wind tunnel that channeled frigid air directly under his floors. Every gust that hit the cabin drove Arctic air through that crawl space, turning the underside of his floorboards into a sheet of ice. Meanwhile, Lars Halvorsen moved calmly through his own cabin, checking his children's bedrolls and adding another chunk of maple to his smaller but more efficient heating setup. His mercury thermometer, hung at the same height as Silas's, showed room air at 58 degrees, 4 degrees cooler than his neighbor's superheated cabin. But when Lars knelt and held his lantern to his floorboards, the reading told a dramatically different story. 51 degrees. The floor of Lars's cabin registered 51 degrees while Silas's measured 17. A difference of 34 degrees, achieved not through burning more fuel or building a larger fire, but through a simple principle that every stonemason in Norway understood: stop the wind and let the earth do its work. The difference lay just outside, invisible in the howling darkness, but measurably present in every square foot of living space. While Silas's cabin sat exposed on its piers like a bridge spanning a frozen creek, Lars's cabin rested inside a low fortress of fieldstone. The dry stacked wall he had built around his pier foundation rose 36 inches from grade, built with the patient precision of a man who had learned to work stone in a country where winter meant survival or death. That stone skirt blocked every cubic foot of wind that would otherwise have scoured the underside of his floors. Instead of Arctic air screaming through his crawl space at 60 miles per hour, Lars had created a pocket of still air that gradually warmed toward the Earth's more stable temperature. The ground 4 feet below the surface maintained a steady 45 to 50 degrees year-round, and without wind to strip that modest heat away, his floor cavity became a reservoir of captured warmth instead of a frozen wasteland. By 9 o'clock, that night, with the temperature outside dropping toward 11 below zero and still falling, the contrast between the two cabins had become a matter of survival rather than comfort. At Silas's place, the family had abandoned any pretense of normal evening activities. They pulled their mattresses close to the stove and piled on every quilt and blanket they owned, creating a nest of shared body heat in the small space where floor-level temperatures approached something livable. The children wore their heaviest coats indoors and still shivered. But at Lars's cabin, something unprecedented was happening. Through the storm, neighbors began arriving at his door, not to borrow sugar or trade news, but to borrow survival itself. First came the widow Morrison with her twin boys, their own cabin too cold to sustain them through what was clearly going to be a multi-day siege. Then the Chandler family, their baby girl's lips blue despite being wrapped in wool and held close to their own stove. Lars opened his door without ceremony and waved them toward the warmth. His cabin, designed for a family of 5, now sheltered 14 people. Yet the floor remained warm enough for children to sit and play without numbing their bodies against the boards. The women could tend the baby on a quilt spread directly on the floor, and the men could pull off their boots without watching their feet turn white with cold. Outside, the wind continued its assault, piling snow into drifts that would reach 15 feet by morning and claiming lives across the territory. Inside Lars's stone-skirted cabin, the mercury held steady at 51 degrees where it mattered most, at the level where people lived, worked, and tried to survive the longest night of the hardest winter in memory. 5 years earlier, in the spring of 1883, Lars Halvorsen had filed his homestead claim on 160 acres of rolling prairie 2 miles south of what would eventually become the town of Millerville. Like every other settler racing to establish residency before winter, he needed a cabin fast. The Homestead Act required actual habitation within 6 months, and Lars had arrived in late May with summer already burning off the morning dew and the building season shrinking toward the critical deadline of first frost. He followed the standard frontier playbook exactly: cut and skid lodge pole pine from the creek bottom, notch the logs with a broad axe and adze borrowed from a neighbor, set 10 stone piers in a rectangular pattern 16 feet by 20 feet, each pier rising 24 inches above grade to keep the log sills clear of ground moisture and spring flooding. The design was time-tested across the northern plains, quick to build, economical with materials, and engineered around the primary enemies of log construction: rot, insects, and the seasonal freeze-thaw cycle that could shift a foundation and crack every joint in a wall. By October, Lars had a solid cabin with a stone chimney, split shingle roof, and gaps between the logs chinked tight with clay and prairie grass. His neighbors nodded approval at the workmanship and the speed. Silas Morrow, who had built 3 similar cabins in the township, pronounced it proper frontier construction and predicted the pier foundation would outlast anything set directly on grade. The 24-inch crawl space would keep air moving, prevent moisture buildup, and ensure the structural timbers stayed sound for decades. Then winter taught Lars the difference between structural soundness and human comfort. On calm nights, his cabin heated reasonably well. The cast iron stove he had hauled from Fargo threw heat into the 16 by 20-foot space with enough intensity to make the air near the ceiling uncomfortably warm. But when the wind picked up, and on the Dakota prairie, wind was as constant as sunrise, the cabin became a study in thermal defeat. Heat poured out through the floor as if the boards were sieves. Lars began measuring the problem with the methodical precision of a man trained to build in a climate where mistakes froze livestock and bankrupted families. On a typical January night with outside temperatures at 15 below and a steady 20-mile-per-hour wind, his stove burned through a quarter cord of split oak to maintain 60 degrees at head height. But the floor told a different story. Standing on the boards in stocking feet became painful within minutes. A pan of water set on the floor overnight froze solid. Most telling of all, his children abandoned their floor-level play area entirely, spending winter evenings perched on chairs and benches like birds on roosts. The problem was elementary physics disguised as proper construction. Every gust of wind that hit the cabin drove frigid air through that 24-inch crawl space at whatever speed the prairie delivered. The underside of his floorboards became a heat exchanger, constantly cooled by the stream of Arctic air flowing beneath. No amount of fuel could overcome the convective heat loss. He was essentially trying to heat the outdoors, 1 cubic foot of moving air at a time. Lars began asking questions. At the general store in Millerville, he found Emil Hogan, an older Norwegian who had homesteaded in Minnesota before trying his luck in Dakota Territory. Emil listened to the problem and shrugged. Back home, we bank up for winter. Sod, straw, whatever stops the wind. Come spring, pull it away for the air to move again. But Emil had built his new cabin on a full stone foundation, not piers, eliminating the crawl space entirely. His advice was practical but didn't translate to a structure already built and occupied. The real education came from an unexpected source. Martha Tisdale, the schoolteacher who boarded with different families throughout her circuit, mentioned that she had spent 2 weeks the previous winter with a mixed-blood family living in what she described as an earth lodge near the agency. "Warmest house I ever sat in," she said. "Built into a hillside with sod thick as a man's arm over pole rafters. The floor stayed so warm the children played barefoot even when it was 20 below outside." Lars had seen similar structures during his brief time working construction jobs in settlements closer to the Missouri River. The earth lodges built by Mandan and Hidatsa families were engineering marvels disguised as primitive dwellings, 40 to 60 feet in diameter, framed with massive cottonwood timbers and covered with layers of willow, grass, and earth totaling 3 feet thick. The structures were nearly invisible from a distance, blending into the landscape like natural hills. But inside, they maintained comfortable temperatures through the harshest winter weather using minimal fuel and no metal stoves at all. The principle was mass and thermal buffering. Earth was an insulator and a heat reservoir. Wind was the enemy of both. The earth lodge builders had solved the problem by eliminating wind entirely, creating a structure so thoroughly coupled to the ground's stable temperature that interior conditions barely fluctuated regardless of surface weather. Lars could not build an earth lodge. His cabin already stood, and his neighbors would question his sanity if he tried to bury a perfectly good log structure under 3 feet of sod. But he could borrow the essential insight, stop the wind, and let the earth contribute its modest but steady warmth to the equation. Through the summer of 1884, he refined the idea. Not sod banking, which was seasonal and labor-intensive. Not earth berming, which would trap moisture against his log sills and create the rot problems his pier foundation was designed to prevent. Stone, dry-laid fieldstone stacked into a low wall that would block wind but allow controlled ventilation, enclose the crawl space but permit access for maintenance, and use materials available on every quarter section of Dakota prairie. When he mentioned the plan at the next barn raising, the response was immediate and predictable. Silas Morrow laughed outright. "You're building a useless little fortress under a perfectly good cabin. Air under the house keeps it healthy. Trap that air and you'll rot your sills inside of 5 years." Others nodded agreement. Stone belonged in foundations and root cellars, not wrapped around empty space like some medieval castle wall. The consensus was clear. Lars was overthinking a problem that had a simple solution: burn more wood, dress warmer, and accept that frontier living meant frontier discomfort. But Lars had measured the heat loss, calculated the fuel cost, and spent too many nights listening to his children's teeth chatter to accept conventional wisdom without testing an alternative. By September, he was hauling fieldstone. Construction began on a crisp September morning in 1884, with the first frost still weeks away but the urgency of winter already pressing against every daylight hour. Lars started by walking the perimeter of his cabin with a ball of twine, marking a line 18 inches out from the existing pier foundations. The wall would follow the cabin's outline exactly, creating a rectangular enclosure 16 by 20 feet on the outside, with enough clearance to access each stone pier for future maintenance or repair. The foundation trench came first. Lars marked a shallow excavation 6 inches deep and 14 inches wide, following his string line with the precision of a man who understood that frontier construction allowed no margin for careless measurement. He dug by hand with a mattock and spade, removing the prairie sod in neat rectangles that he stacked for later use in his garden. Below the grass roots, he encountered the dense clay subsoil, characteristic of glacial prairie, sticky when wet, hard as brick when dry, but stable enough to support substantial weight without shifting or settling. Into this trench went a layer of coarse gravel hauled from the creek bottom 2 miles south, followed by fist-sized stones selected for their flat surfaces and angular edges. This base course would prevent the wall from pumping mud during spring thaw, when alternate freezing and warming could turn solid ground into a morass that would undermine the most careful stonework. Lars had watched too many frontier foundations fail from inadequate drainage to risk shortcuts at this critical stage. The stone selection process revealed the methodical thinking that separated competent frontier craftsmen from those whose structures failed within a decade. Lars spent 4 days walking his quarter section, identifying and marking fieldstone that met his specifications. The best pieces were limestone and granite erratics left by retreating glaciers, stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, but retaining the flat faces and angular corners that would stack securely without mortar. He rejected rounded river stones that would roll out of position, fractured pieces that would split under frost pressure, and sandstone blocks too soft to bear weight through multiple freeze-thaw cycles. Each stone was tested by hand for weight and balance. The largest pieces, destined for the foundation course, weighed 60 to 80 pounds and required careful positioning to create level-bearing surfaces for the courses above. Medium stones, 30 to 50 pounds each, would form the main body of the wall. Smaller fragments, from fist size down to gravel, would serve as harding, the loose stone packed behind and between the face stones to lock each course in position and prevent shifting. The actual laying began with the cornerstones, massive blocks positioned at each corner of the rectangle and leveled using wooden wedges and a water-filled mason's level borrowed from the township's only professional builder. From these corners, Lars stretched string lines to guide the first course, ensuring that his wall would rise plumb and straight despite being built without mortar or mechanical fasteners. The dry stacking technique followed principles perfected over centuries in Norway and Scotland, where stone was abundant, and mortar was a luxury that most farmers could not afford. Each stone was placed with its longest dimension running into the wall, not parallel to it, creating maximum stability and preventing the face from separating from the harding. Vertical joints were broken systematically, with each stone bridging the gap between 2 stones in the course below, distributing weight evenly and preventing the formation of weak vertical lines that could cause catastrophic failure. Most critically, Lars built the wall with a slight inward lean, what masons called batter, tilting each course perhaps 2 degrees toward the center of the enclosed space. This inward lean gave the wall inherent stability against lateral forces, whether from wind pressure, frost heaving, or the settling that inevitably affected any structure built on prairie soil. The technique also shed water naturally, preventing the accumulation of moisture that could freeze, expand, and blow apart even the most carefully fitted stonework. As the wall rose course by course, Lars faced the crucial question of ventilation. Completely sealing the crawl space would indeed create the moisture trap that Silas Morrow had warned against, potentially rotting the cabin's sill logs within a few seasons. But leaving the space wide open defeated the entire purpose of wind control. The solution was controlled airflow, small openings that could be adjusted seasonally to provide necessary ventilation without surrendering thermal performance. At 30 inches above grade, Lars built two ventilation openings into opposite walls, each measuring 4 inches by 8 inches, and fitted with wooden plugs that could be removed during warm weather and replaced when winter demanded maximum wind protection. The openings were positioned to create cross-ventilation during summer months, while remaining small enough to plug effectively when heating season arrived. The completed wall stood 36 inches above grade, high enough to block wind-driven convection, but low enough to avoid overwhelming the modest proportions of the cabin above. The stonework consumed an estimated 8 tons of field stone, every pound of it hauled by hand or dragged on a stone boat constructed from split logs and iron rings. The wall thickness varied from 14 inches at the base to 12 inches at the top, tapering slightly as it rose to reduce weight and improve stability. Access remained through a removable wooden panel built into the south wall, large enough for a man to crawl through for maintenance, but sturdy enough to provide wind protection when secured in place. The panel was fitted with leather hinges and secured with wooden pins, allowing quick removal if emergency access was required, but maintaining the wall's integrity. During normal operation, the final detail was capping. Rather than attempting to create a level stone surface across the top of the wall, Lars fitted rough-hewn boards as a cap, spiked to wooden blocks embedded in the stonework at regular intervals. This wooden cap shed water away from the wall interior, provided a clean visual line around the cabin's base, and created a platform where tools or materials could be temporarily placed during maintenance work. By the first week of October, with the leaves turning gold in the creek-bottom timber and nighttime temperatures dropping toward freezing, Lars's stone skirt was complete. The wall enclosed nearly 300 square feet of crawl space, transforming the windy cavity beneath his cabin into a controlled environment that would either validate or demolish 18 months of planning and 6 weeks of backbreaking labor. Winter would be the ultimate judge of his unconventional engineering, and winter was already sharpening its teeth on the northern horizon. The winter of 1887 through 1888 tested frontier construction across the northern plains with a succession of storms that would become legend, but none matched the violence of what struck on January 12th. The day began with deceptive mildness that lured children to school in light jackets and convinced farmers that spring might come early. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 44 degrees, warm enough for shirt-sleeve work and hanging laundry. But experienced plainsmen read the signs that newcomers missed: the peculiar stillness in the air, the yellow-tinged light on the western horizon, and the behavior of livestock clustering near shelter with their backs to the wind. The atmospheric collision that followed demonstrated why the Dakota Prairie earned its reputation as one of the most climatically violent regions in North America. A massive Arctic air mass, heavy with moisture and driven by jet stream winds, slammed into the warm surface air with the force of a geological event. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in 8 hours, falling from that mild 44 degrees at midday to 20 below zero by 10 o'clock at night, with the mercury continuing its descent toward 42 below before dawn. But temperature alone did not define this storm's destructive power. Wind speeds reached sustained velocities of 60 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 80. These were not the steady prairie winds that frontier families had learned to endure, but chaotic shifting blasts that changed direction without warning and carried enough force to flatten buildings and drive snow through gaps that seemed impossibly small. Visibility dropped to zero within minutes as the wind lifted snow from the ground and mixed it with new precipitation falling from the black sky above. In cabins across the territory, families discovered that their heating systems had been designed for normal winter weather, not for this meteorological catastrophe. Stoves that easily warmed living spaces during typical cold snaps now roared like furnaces while failing to maintain livable temperatures. The problem was not fuel supply or stove capacity, but heat loss accelerated beyond any engineer's calculations by wind speeds that turned every gap, crack, and thermal bridge into a pathway for precious warmth to escape. At Silas Morrow's cabin, the family fought a losing battle against physics and atmospheric violence. His cast iron stove, fed with seasoned oak cut the previous summer, glowed cherry red as it consumed fuel at triple the normal rate. The air temperature near the ceiling reached 72 degrees, hot enough to make a man sweat if he climbed into the loft space. But that superheated air rose directly to the rafters and disappeared, lost through tiny gaps in the roof boards and around the chimney penetration faster than the stove could replace it. At floor level, where his family lived and worked, the story was entirely different. The open crawl space beneath Silas's cabin had become a wind tunnel that channeled 60-mile-per-hour Arctic blasts directly under his floorboards. Every board foot of air that screamed through that 24-inch high cavity stripped heat from the underside of his floors through convective cooling so intense that it overwhelmed any amount of radiant heat from above. The mercury thermometer that Silas held near his floorboards read 12 degrees at 7 o'clock in the evening, dropping to 8 degrees by midnight. Ice formed on the interior surface of the floorboards themselves, creating a skating rink beneath his children's feet. Water buckets set on the floor froze solid within an hour, splitting the wooden staves as expanding ice overcame the cooper's ironwork. Boots and shoes left on the floor overnight became rigid sculptures that required thawing near the stove before anyone could wear them. Most critically, the children could not sit or play on the floor at all, forced to cluster on chairs and benches in the small zone of marginal warmth that extended perhaps 4 feet out from the stove. The Morrow family burned through their entire week's supply of fuel in 2 days, then began breaking up furniture and burning fence posts hauled from the woodshed in desperate trips through the howling darkness. Yet despite consuming enough fuel to heat their cabin for a month under normal conditions, they could not make the living space truly livable. They survived by abandoning the majority of their floor area and crowding into a space no larger than 8 feet by 8 feet, directly adjacent to their stove, wrapped in every blanket and coat they owned. 200 yards away, Lars Halverson's family experienced the same storm as if they lived in a different climate zone. His stone skirt wall, invisible in the driving snow, but measurably present in every square foot of living space, had eliminated the convective heat loss that was destroying his neighbors' comfort and consuming their fuel supply. The crawl space beneath his cabin contained still air that gradually warmed toward the Earth's stable temperature, creating a thermal buffer between his floors and the Arctic chaos outside. The mercury thermometer in Lars's cabin told a story of engineering triumph disguised as modest preparation. Room air temperature held steady at 58 degrees, maintained with half the fuel that Silas was burning to achieve far inferior results. But the real victory was measured at floor level, where the thermometer read a steady 51 degrees throughout the worst of the storm. His children played on quilts spread directly on the floorboards, comfortable enough to sit motionless for extended periods without numbing their bodies against the wood. This 39-degree difference between floor temperatures in the two cabins, 51 degrees in Lars's enclosed crawl space versus 12 degrees in Silas's open foundation, represented more than superior comfort. It meant the difference between a living space and a survival space, between a home where normal family life could continue and a shelter where human beings huddled like refugees from their own construction choices. As word of the temperature differential spread through the storm-isolated community, Lars's cabin became an unofficial refugee center. The widow Morrison arrived first, carrying her twin boys through snow that reached their waists. Her own cabin, built on the same pier foundation system that Silas used, had become uninhabitable as floor-level temperatures dropped below freezing despite a roaring fire. The Chandler family followed, their infant daughter's lips blue with cold that no amount of bundling could overcome in their frozen cabin. By dawn, on January 13th, 14 people sheltered in Lars's 16 by 20-foot cabin, yet the floor remained warm enough for children to sleep on pallets laid directly on the boards. The stone wall that neighbors had mocked as unnecessary labor now stood as the difference between community survival and individual catastrophe, proving that unconventional engineering solutions sometimes emerged not from academic theory, but from methodical observation of how heat moved, how wind attacked, and how the Earth itself could become an ally in the endless frontier battle against winter's violence. Dawn on January 13th revealed a landscape transformed into an Arctic wasteland, with snow drifted to the cabin eaves and temperatures still hovering near 30 below zero. The wind had finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a silence so complete that the creak of settling timbers sounded like gunshots in the crystalline air. But for Lars Halvorsen, the most significant sound was the steady knock on his cabin door as neighbors arrived, not to offer congratulations on surviving the storm, but to ask the question that would reshape frontier construction across the northern plains. How had he done it? Silas Morrow was the first to arrive, his pride clearly wrestling with necessity as he stood in the doorway holding a steaming cup of coffee that had frozen solid during the 100-yard walk between cabins. Behind him came Jonas Pritchard, Emil Haugen, and three other homesteaders whose own heating battles had left them hollow-eyed and desperate for answers. These were men accustomed to solving problems with axe and saw, not to seeking advice about construction techniques they had dismissed as foolish labor only months before. The evidence was undeniable and measurable. While their cabins had consumed cord after cord of precious fuel to maintain barely livable conditions, Lars had heated his larger household with half the wood they had burned individually. More importantly, his floors had remained warm enough for normal family life, while theirs had become frozen zones that forced entire families to live like refugees within their own homes. The 35-degree temperature difference was not a matter of opinion or comfort preference. It was documented fact that any man could verify with his own thermometer. Lars walked them through the stone wall's construction with the patient precision of a teacher addressing students who had initially failed to grasp a fundamental lesson. He explained the simple physics. Wind was the enemy of heat retention, and stopping wind allowed the Earth's modest but steady warmth to contribute to the thermal equation. The crawl space beneath his cabin, protected from Arctic air movement, had stabilized at temperatures much closer to the ground's natural 45 to 50 degree range than to the minus 40 degrees that had dominated the surface weather. The demonstration was more convincing than any theoretical explanation. Lars lifted the wooden access panel in his south wall and invited Silas to crawl into the enclosed space with a lantern and thermometer. Even with outside air still registering 28 below, the temperature inside the protected crawl space read 43 degrees, a 71-degree difference achieved entirely through wind control and thermal coupling with the stable earth below. By March, the first copycat construction was underway. Jonas Pritchard began the spring building season not with a new cabin, but with stone hauling, dragging field stone from the same glacier-scattered deposits that Lars had mined the previous fall. His approach was pure frontier pragmatism. No fancy techniques or borrowed equipment, just the systematic application of a proven method using materials available on every quarter section of prairie land. Pritchard's wall rose through April and May with modifications that reflected both local conditions and individual preferences. Where Lars had built straight stone courses, Jonas created a slight outward flare at the base for additional stability in the clay soil that dominated his particular section. Where Lars had used wooden vent plugs, Jonas fashioned iron closures from discarded wagon hardware, creating vents that could be operated from outside the crawl space without removing access panels. The technique spread through the community with the organic inevitability of useful knowledge shared among practical people. Emil Haugen adapted the concept to his existing full foundation cabin by building a secondary wind wall 18 inches out from his original stone foundation, creating a double wall system with an air gap that provided even better thermal performance than Lars's single wall design. The Chandler family, building their first permanent cabin after 2 seasons in a dugout, incorporated the stone skirt from the beginning, treating wind control as a basic requirement rather than an optional improvement. By the fall of 1888, 6 cabins in the township featured some variation of Lars's stone skirting system. Each builder had modified the technique to suit local materials, soil conditions, and individual skills, but all had embraced the fundamental insight that wind control was as important as fuel supply in frontier heating systems. The modifications ranged from Jonas's iron vents to Martha Keene's innovative use of clay chinking between stones to eliminate even minor air infiltration. The most significant validation came not from individual adoption, but from institutional recognition. The township's informal building code, really just a collection of shared practices passed between neighbors, began to include stone skirting as standard practice for pier foundation cabins. New homesteaders arriving in the territory received advice that explicitly recommended wind control measures, and local suppliers began stocking iron vent hardware specifically designed for crawlspace applications. The technique's success lay not in revolutionary innovation, but in the intelligent application of principles that indigenous builders had understood for centuries. The earth lodge construction that Lars had observed near the Missouri River agencies represented thousands of years of engineering refinement focused on thermal efficiency, structural stability, and resource conservation. Those builders had learned to treat the earth as an active partner in climate control, rather than simply a platform for construction. Modern building science would eventually codify these insights in terms of thermal bridging, convective heat loss, and ground coupling, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged from what Plains tribes had practiced for generations. Mass and earth defeated wind and weather more reliably than fuel consumption and structural heating. The earth maintained relatively stable temperatures year-round, typically ranging from 40 to 70 degrees depending on depth and season, while surface air temperatures could swing more than 100 degrees between summer and winter extremes. Lars's stone wall had simply created a controlled interface between these two thermal environments, allowing his cabin to benefit from the Earth's stability rather than fighting against the atmosphere's violence. The technique required no imported materials, no specialized tools, and no engineering knowledge beyond what any competent stoneworker possessed. It was frontier innovation at its most practical, the application of available materials and traditional knowledge to solve a specific problem that conventional methods had failed to address. The legacy extended beyond individual comfort or fuel savings. In a region where winter survival often depended on marginal differences in heat retention, building technique, and resource management, Lars's stone skirting represented the kind of incremental improvement that separated successful homesteads from abandoned claims. On the plains, where the difference between thriving and merely surviving was often measured in degrees of warmth, cords of saved fuel, and families who lived to see spring, the man who understood wind control had given his community a tool for turning harsh country into livable country, one stone at a time.